Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. Hopefully you caught our first episode of this bye week. Had a lot of fun breaking things down with Landon Tengwall, former Nittany Lions starting offensive lineman turned media member, and does a great job breaking things down from a film standpoint, a lot of different directions. But he gave us insight into this locker room a bit and told us what stands out with Nick Singleton, Drew Aller, the defense thus far. A lot to look at. And if you missed it, I encourage you to check that episode out. It dropped on Tuesday. We're only bringing you 2 episodes during this bye week. We'll get back to our 4-episode format next week with the Oregon matchup on tap. But we bring in Daniel Gallen this time around. I mentioned at the end of our last episode that I'm down visiting my parents in Florida, taking advantage of this bye week and brought my daughter down here. So that means I wasn't on the practice field on Tuesday. It also means I have great teammates who allow me to do these kind of things. And Daniel is one of them. And Daniel Gallen joins us on the Lions247 Podcast to start things off. And we're going to tap into your knowledge because you were the man with feet on the ground at practice. You were standing next to James Franklin. We were both on some coordinator calls this week as well. So we have plenty to discuss. And I think we can start in a lot of places, but ultimately we haven't heard from you, Daniel, since Penn State improved to 3-0. Big tip of the cap to our guy, Tyler Calvaruso, for filling your shoes in the press box and on the post-game podcast last Saturday following that win over Villanova. I know you've had a chance to rewatch some things, go through some of your own notes on the matchup. So why don't we start there, Daniel? What stood out to you from that Villanova victory and Penn State getting to 3-0?
Yeah, you talk about teamwork. This has just been a big week for teamwork at Lions247, which is a lot of fun. I went back through and I rewatched the game when I got back in town. And it was one of those things where on Saturday, I was very intentional with, not really following along with things. Partially because I'm at a wedding, want to have fun and enjoy it. But the other thing was that I really wanted to consume the game at once. I didn't want to, get these bits and pieces of things. I didn't know what the score was until pretty late on Saturday. Didn't really see any highlights until I really turned the game on. And so the one thing that stood out to me was that I think it was one of those games where in the moment when you're in the stadium and you're living with it drive by drive, I can really understand coming away maybe frustrated or seeing it as more of the same in certain aspects from the first 2 games. But, watching it, at a little bit of a remove and, maybe without that same investment that, I would have in the press box, that sort of thing. It just really felt like a ho-hum victory. Like I didn't really view too many red flags coming out of it. I do think you saw some of the things with Drew Aller persist in terms of, missing a couple throws here and there, but also that throw to Trevor Pena up the middle, probably one of the better throws we've seen Aller make for that touchdown, just fitting it in that type of window, on time to his receiver. I think sort of what James Franklin talked about Tuesday night, there's only a few people in the world that can make that throw, and Drew Aller is one of them. So I came away, and I think also like the Nick Singleton stuff, like I saw some commentary when I was logging back on that, it was more of the same from him, but I thought he had a really solid afternoon. And then Katron Allen is just, I think at a different level right now. But I thought Singleton looked a little bit improved from the FIU game. So that's a little bit of a remove. Defense, really good. I think that's another big takeaway. You did what you need to do against an FCS team, and they need a miracle play at the end to avoid a shutout. One of the crazier plays I've ever seen. Probably would have been one of the craziest plays I'd ever seen in person if I was there. So it's probably the big thing I missed from Saturday. But I think overall it was what you wanted to see. Like I saw 52-6 as the final score Saturday night, and I was like, okay, that tracks. It's about what we expected. The process to get there, I think, had some hiccups here and there, but I don't really think my view of Penn State changed, from that one game against Villanova.
If you were hoping for doom and gloom from Daniel Gallen about a team that's outscored opponents by more than 100 points, you're not going to get that. We focused a lot on some inconsistencies offensively with Landon Tengwall last week, and one of the topics as well, or earlier this week, I should say, one of the topics as well was how Penn State is handling that running back tandem now in year 4 together. And I know you think it was a solid day for Nick Singleton. I certainly think he's taking, I don't know if he's taking a huge step forward, but I think he's working on baby steps, and maybe that's what you'd like to see right now. But I think right now, Daniel, what we were discussing in post game, what I asked Franklin directly about was the fact that Katron Allen wasn't getting a touch until the fourth series, that Nick Singleton had 8 carries on the first possession, matching his entire total from game one. James Franklin says this was not a concerted effort to, quote unquote, get right for Nick Singleton, but it looked that way. What did you make of kind of that usage, the fact that it was 20 touches to 6 going into the fourth quarter? I think you as well have watched every single game of these players' career together, and that's just different than anything we've ever seen in any matchup.
I think it's different in the context of those two. I mean, I think that it's really it's been funny in the past. I think in 2022, you looked and we were like 7 games into the season and they had the exact same amount of carries. I think they finished maybe 2023 like literally 1 carry apart, 171 to 172. But I think that just in the context of them, I think that deviates a little from the norm. But I think what we've seen from Penn State during this non-conference slate, it fits in a little bit. Where, that first drive of the game against Nevada, like you're feeding Kyron Hudson and Trevor Pena. I think when you came out in game 2, I think you saw a little bit of a concerted effort to get the ball to Khalil Dinkins and those tight ends. And so I think it's just, they look at these games as, there's something that they want to accomplish. And I think that, maybe it wasn't necessarily, Nick Singleton needs to get right. Maybe it's, we've coached Nick Singleton on these things. We need to see it in a game. Maybe instead of getting right, he needs to pass a test, or he needs to show his work a little bit. So yeah, I mean, it stood out to me. I don't have the drive chart in front of me, but I do feel like there was a little bit of game flow stuff early on in terms of that first drive was really long and it was on the ground, and then I think Katron Allen was out for the next drive and it was a short one. Or whenever we saw Katron Allen, he was out for a shorter drive and then it was a Singleton drive again and it was long. So I do think there is some game flow that factors into it. But overall, I mean, I feel like James Franklin would never feel like Nick Singleton is the type of player who needs a get right game. I think that they view him as a guy who's always ready to go, always on top of things. But yeah, to me, I just viewed it as fitting in with some of the themes that we've seen in terms of getting certain players involved, putting them in situations, seeing what you have, meshing them in with the offense, and then being able to, evaluate what you have there and then move forward.
I'm going to agree with you on a lot of that. And we're going to get into some of that in just a second about like how much was Penn State playing against their opponents versus how much were they trying to ready themselves for Big Ten action and bigger tests. But I do think it's just notable, as you noted, that James Franklin doesn't probably feel that Nick Singleton's type of player to use a get-right game. But was it 5 days earlier, he was publicly saying that Nick Singleton was overthinking things. Nick Singleton needs to let it rip. And so it's interesting. And maybe we see Nick Singleton go 75 yards on the first play against Oregon, and we all forget about some of the maybe missteps earlier in the season. He's that kind of player. He's proven that in the past, where you flick a switch all of a sudden and you got a 3-game sample size coming up, and it's great. So we'll see what Nick Singleton is. Katron Allen certainly has been a steady force on the ground going back to last winter, and that's continued in this season. But Daniel, how much of that is on your mind in terms of what we've actually learned about Penn State, how they're going to operate against the Oregons on their schedule? And part of it is how much of these first 3 games was Andy Kotelnicki placing extra emphasis on things? How much was it trying to feed certain players? And how much of that kind of goes by the wayside when you got to strap it up for 60 minutes in a highly contested matchup?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said it before. Like, I'm not one of these people that thinks that we're going to see a completely different team come out against Oregon, and we'll see the real playbook. Like, we've just been seeing the fake playbook these past couple of weeks. I do know that you keep certain things in your back pocket, or you do certain things that you'll be able to build on as the season goes on. Like these game plans, yeah, they're for a specific game, but there's also a connection between them as you go through an entire season, in terms of showing different things, setting different things up. But I do feel like that there is an element of, I think you hope, if you're a Penn State fan, that you haven't seen them try to operate at a real full capacity yet, because there's been some things that, that lack of explosive plays, some of the things in the passing game, Drew Aller with the back-to-back games below 58% completion percentage. These are things that catch your eye a little bit. But I do think there's also the element where Like if you're going to beat a team like Oregon, like you're not going to complete 85% of your passes and, have two backs go over 100 yards. It's going to be a dogfight. Like it's not going to be a clean game. So I do think that in some respect, like, Penn State seeing some of this adversity early, having to navigate some of these situations, I think it can be a little bit of a positive moving forward where, I wouldn't say any of these teams have really like punched Penn State in the mouth. But it's the thing where, maybe they've tasted their own blood a little bit where, they've gotten booed, in the first half against FIU. Like, they've had to figure out, okay, this isn't working. How are we, working through this? And it's probably better that the first time you have to do that is against FIU than it is against Oregon. Just the process of thinking through those things of, trying to figure out, what's going on and rebounding from certain things. I think that there is, a benefit to, not necessarily having your non-conference slate before maybe 370-0 wins. But we'll see. I mean, everything really, you're just going to learn so much in that game. I do think that we'll probably see some things that we haven't seen before. I think Franklin, it was like the Nevada game where he was like, yeah, they were doing things on defense that were not on tape at all. So all teams do this. All coaches, keep different wrinkles, for different situations like this for their big games. And I think that Penn State is no different. We'll see. I mean, I think that that's really what the conclusion comes down to.
Didn't we know it would be we'll see come September 19th, September 20th? Didn't we know that would be kind of the mindset of we still got to see.
Oh yeah, and it's the thing where it's so easy in mid-August, mid-July, to be like, we probably won't learn too much about this team coming out of these three non-conference slates, and now that we're in it, we're like, we should have learned a lot about this team through these three non-conference games. But we'll see. I mean, this is what the non-conference approach is going to be for these next couple of years to begin with. So I think that we got to take some things away from this too, in terms of learning about this team and learning how to approach things.
Yeah, I'll say this: if they beat Oregon, all that consternation that was felt in Beaver Stadium and the boos, people forget about it. Maybe not some of those players; they may remember some of those boos, but the fans will move on from that moment. If things go awry against Oregon, and some of the maybe trending negatives that popped up during this conference play are a reason why things go wrong against Oregon, then people are going to really start to pile on what they witnessed early on. But look, it's up to Penn State. They can go out, and a lot of people have labeled it as a preseason run. I think that's pretty fair overall. The wins count, the losses count. Players getting hurt counts, but they can't come out of that preseason, if you want to call it that, without the loss, and relatively healthy as well, Daniel. I think that's maybe where we can pick up the conversation going into the practice observation that we got this week. And Penn State's in a pretty good spot from a health standpoint. And I'll knock on wood for everybody because I can already hear some of our listeners being like, what the hell, Tyler? Why are you saying that out loud? I believe I tweeted that Penn State had not given up a turnover last week during the game. And then like 30 seconds later, Aller throws the interception looking for Katron Allen. So I'll try to be careful here. But Daniel, it's a pretty good thing to get to Oregon and not have two or three guys in that questionable category, as far as we understand.
Yeah, I think that you're happy with where you are health wise. If you're Penn State, there haven't really been the games haven't stopped, and you haven't had to come out and get a guy off the field. I think that that's a pretty big benefit. And then you look at the pregame availability reports, and the guys that are ruled out. You look at it and you're like, okay, like these are guys that. Maybe by the end of the year you thought might be in the mix for the 2 deep, or maybe you would have liked to see them get a little bit of action in non-conference play, but there hasn't been anything that stood out too much. I do think that there's a couple players that we haven't seen or haven't seen too much of. I think like Quentin Martin comes to mind as one of those. So you monitor that a little bit. But in terms of what we projected as Penn State's 2 deep in mid-July, where we are 2 months later after 3 games and a ton of practices, we know that last year Penn State had a really physical approach, and you had a couple guys get banged up as you went through. But I think most of the 2 deep is pretty intact. From where we stand right now. Big Ten play will be a little bit of a different animal, I think, in terms of the physicality that you'll bring and the types of bodies that'll be colliding with one another. But I think you do feel good about the health right now.
The only two real notable absences last week, in terms of guys who were listed as out who had been playing before, were like young lineman DeAndre Cook and Malachi Williams, who combined for probably 15 snaps against FIU. So if those are kind of the headline absences, that's a good spot to be. And I'll also note that they've gotten good returns from the guys who have returned from injury, whether it's Andrew Rapplier at tight end, Alonzo Ford at defensive tackle, Nolan Rucci, Anthony Donko. I know Landon Tengwall talked about it being a process for Donko working alongside Rucci, but you've got those guys now getting some opportunities to work off each other with Donko back healthy. And then I think Tony Rojas has been clearly a guy who took a step forward. Last year, we heard about it. I don't know if we all kind of understood just how much he was dealing with physical discomfort during his first year as a starter for much of the way. Now he is not, and I think that's reflected. And by the way, the transfers you've picked up have been kind of plug-and-play pieces as well. So it feels like this 2D, to your point, has kind of been almost refortified in some ways going into Big Ten action, and you like the results thus far. And what did you see on the practice field? I want to definitely preface this by saying bye-week practice looks are usually different than game week practice looks, but what were some of your key takeaways as you spent some time on the field with Team Brennan?
It felt like a very business-like practice for the bye week. It wasn't necessarily the most intense practice that we've seen, but it also wasn't the most laid back. Like Terry Smith is still getting on his cornerbacks during one-on-one drills, all those sorts of things. I think maybe the most notable thing from a participation standpoint, Denai Dennis Sutton didn't do anything while we were there. He was dressed in pads, but he had his helmet off, and during one of those like running drills, the half line drills where they have half an O line against half a D line, and it's I think it's thud, like there's some contact. He just was on one knee, but the rest of the defenders watching that. So I think that was the one thing that stood out. But James Franklin said afterwards, not specifically mentioning Dennis Sutton, but said that they manage their veteran players at this point. Like they know what they can do. They know what they need to do. And that's consistent with what we hear in the spring, what we hear in the preseason camp. And I think that Dennis Sutton that's one of those guys where you know what you're going to get every week when he's out there. But overall, in practice, we got to see some wide receiver, defensive back one-on-ones. Brennan has some really nice highlights on there. The one thing that stands up to me, and it's partially because I saw the play live, and then I keep seeing it from the reverse angle in the corner of my screen a bunch, is Ethan Black, the walk-on wide receiver speedster. Like he burned Xavier Thomas up the right side and made a really nice sliding catch. Tracked the ball, got under it, hauled it in. It was one of those plays where you see it live from one angle and you're just like, wow, like that was just really a really nice play. There's a staffer on the side who made a comment to Xavier Thomas that was something along the lines of like, yeah, that guy's really fast, huh? and when you know Ethan Black's background, that really tracks. Tyseer Denmark was someone who popped in that environment. He ran this really nice out and up route against King Mac. And of course, King Mac had recovery speed, so was able to get there a little bit to break it up. But Denmark just looked really smooth, really deliberate in his breaks. He had another crossing route where he made a catch later in practice. And a crossing route and one-on-ones, like you should be getting separation and being able to make that catch. But that was someone who really popped out to me in there. But yeah, I mean, it's the type of thing where we were trying to take attendance and everyone was there for the most part. We got eyes on people in their normal spots, getting some drills done. And it seemed like, Franklin said that the Tuesday and Wednesday practices were, pretty normal for them. Thursday, they would scale it back a little bit. And I think that pretty much tracked.
Yeah, and we'll get to Tyseer Denmark in a moment because James Franklin had some more commentary on him coming off the practice field. I wanted to get to James now because, Daniel, you were among those there with recording the conversation with James, I'm sure asking some questions as well. He went in a few different directions, but I think we got to start with QB1. It seems every time he gets in front of a microphone, someone asks about Drew Aller and where he's at in his progression. You had a story up at Lions247 after that conversation. You also had a practice notebook. Mark Brennan has video highlights highlights. Grace Brennan put together her photo gallery. So a lot waiting for you at Lions247. And by the way, that little battle that you described between King Mac and Tyseer Denmark will be our featured photo on YouTube and for our article over at Lions247.com. A nice capture by Grace Brennan of both of them going airborne for the ball. But Daniel, when he was speaking about QB1, what stood out to you?
Yeah, Franklin said that they need more, quote, difference-making plays from their quarterback. And I think that tracks with when you talk about where Penn State is and where you want and where they want to go. We say it every year. I feel like we've said it every year. Drew Aller's been the starter. Maybe we even said it when Sean Clifford was starting. But you get into these games where you need that quarterback to be transcendent and to elevate you when things aren't necessarily going well. And we haven't never really seen that from Aller. I think the closest that we've gotten to it was that Big Ten championship game against Oregon, where it was just a very furious comeback. And you saw Aller do some things that we'd never seen him do before, and I don't think we've seen him do them since. And I think really raise his level on that sort of stage. Still fell short, still a questionable pass at the end of a game. But I think that was a game where Aller looked like a difference maker. And so that Franklin, put that out there, that's what they're looking for. He talked about the consistency where you see the throws that you'd like to have back. Talk about that bubble to Nick Singleton against FIU, the interception to Katron Allen. I think that was one of the plays where I think Mark mentioned it in our text thread before I got there in my watch. And so I didn't really know what to expect. And I thought it would just be, staring someone down over the middle. And I was not expecting to see, that type of interception out in the flat. So you see the throws like that, but then like Franklin said, you see that throw to Pena over the middle for the touchdown. And you're like, why can't you do this all the time? A little bit. Now, Franklin also put the onus on the players around Aller too, the supporting cast. He said that basically you want those guys to make the plays that they're supposed to play throughout the game. And then if one of them if they make just one special play over the course of the game, one person, one special play, that really adds up. And you think about the number of running backs they get involved, the number of tight ends they have involved, the number of wide receivers. Like if you get one play that can make a difference from each one of those guys, I think you'd be in pretty good shape over the course of the game. Now, we know that football is imperfect and formulas like that, it's tough to get that to happen week to week. But I thought that was some interesting commentary from Franklin and, looking at the offense holistically beyond just what can Drew Aller do? What does he need to do?
That would seemingly tie into some of his desire for explosive plays where, hey, maybe the play design doesn't create an explosive play, but you can because you're individually making something happen. Of course, when we talk supporting cast, Luke Reynolds has had a great start to the season. We know about the running backs, but those three transfer wide receivers have been in the spotlight ever since they committed to Penn State. And Trevor Pena, Kyron Hudson, and Devontae Ross. We've seen quite a bit of all of them. It's good to see Ross coming along healthy. Hasn't started yet, but he's played a lot of ball now through 3 games. And what was the progress report from James Franklin? You had another story up on this as well regarding those 3 transfer receivers.
Franklin said that you've seen flashes of, I think, their ceilings and then flashes of things that maybe they're not doing so well. So it was, I think, I wouldn't call it mixed. I think it was still overall positive. But I think that he maintained that they still look at it as there's some work for that group to do moving forward. The thing that I thought that was interesting, a framing that he used, and very similar to what I was just talking about with needing special plays from players, is that he said that these wide receivers, he used Devontae Ross as the example that Devontae Ross, over the course of this year, Penn State needs him to be a really good wide receiver. Like that needs to be his floor. But then there's going to be 2 or 3 times where coming out of a game, everyone is talking about Devontae Ross, that they're going to need, 2 or 3 games where he really jumps up, really steps up, is the guy. And he said the same thing for Hudson. Didn't mention Trevor Pena explicitly there, but I think that if you're talking about 2 of them, you can, I think it's implied that Pena is there as well, since the question was about all 3 wide receivers. So we've seen these flashes, like we've seen the different things that these guys can do in terms of making tough catches, getting open, being reliable for Drew Aller, like Pena making that catch on that ball over the middle. So I think there's, we've heard the meat on the bone, metaphor a lot in a couple different places this season, and I think that can be applied to this wide receiver group where you're seeing these positives, you're seeing what they can do, but there's just these areas for growth that are still out there that we're still waiting for it to really click together, and for them to really roll.
Through 3 games, Kyron Hudson leads Penn State with 14 total catches, 156 yards off of those, including a touchdown. Trevor Pena, 13 catches, 166 yards, and a touchdown. You've seen him worked in as a pretty effective rusher as well. Devontae Ross, 5 catches, 77 yards, and a touchdown. He's also been a pretty dynamic punt returner, 3 punt returns of 10-plus yards. I've noted this before, but his individual total through non-conference action matches the entire program total of 10-plus yard punt returns from a 16-game season last year. So you'll love what you're getting from him in that phase of the game. Further down that list of receivers on this team in terms of production thus far, you'll find Tysier Denmark, very modest stat line so far, 2 catches, 17 yards. I think he's probably played maybe 30 snaps through these 3 games, probably less than that. It's been those 3 receivers out of the transfer portal and Liam Clifford getting the bulk of work at this position thus far. But every time James Franklin is asked about Denmark or goes out of his way to talk about Denmark, he says a similar refrain. He's going to be ready when his moment comes. And thus far, he's been the backup to Trevor Pena in the slot. Pena's a guy that we don't foresee spending a lot of time on the sideline in contested games. But when James Franklin's going out of his way publicly, really going back to the spring, Daniel, to put that kind of spotlight on Tysier Denmark, I'm considering this guy a rising talent still, even if we're not quite seeing it in game action yet. And I'm very curious when we'll get a chance to see him do some things in game. I think he had a punt return against FIU. And again, just a couple catches thus far. But he's one of the more intriguing figures on this offense when you think about long season, who could step up, who could maybe be a new supplemental weapon along the way. He's someone who comes to mind.
Yeah, Kobe Howard has outsnapped Denmark at this point through 3 games too, 26-19. So Denmark is someone that we really haven't seen that much of. But it's what you get from being at the games where I think we noticed him on the sideline, maybe in the Nevada game late, where he's running around, jumping around. There's just an enthusiasm out there. We saw him out on the field. I think he had a punt return where there's just the way that he was running, the way that he was looking. There's just like a different level of enthusiasm to see, and that's what you want to see in a late game when someone who hasn't played that much is getting that opportunity. Seemed like that he really embraced it. I think we asked Marcus Hagans about that the next week. He had some good things to say. Asked James Franklin about it last week. He had good things to say, and then brings up Denmark unprompted. He said that after practice, Andy Kotelnicki, it was unclear if it was talking to the team or talking to Franklin, but just brought up Denmark as someone who is putting himself in a position with his approach to be ready. And I think that's a good sign. We talk so much about like the culture of this wide receiver room over the past 2 years, and beyond the lack of production on the field, it did feel like there was a little bit of a concern about behind the scenes, and bringing in guys like Hudson, Pena, and Ross could set an example and maybe reset things a little bit for these younger players. And it seems like this has been really Denmark is someone who really fits into that as someone who embraces the work, goes about things in practice. So yeah, I do think that it is a little bit of a we'll believe it when we see it, like Denmark getting out there and getting some run. At this point, Penn State hasn't really needed him to get out there and get run with how those starters have been playing. But he is one of those guys that I think on your 2 deep, you highlight them as, all right, maybe we can see them at a certain point. What are they going to look like when they get that opportunity? Could they get an opportunity maybe a little bit earlier than garbage time now? And what does that look like? So yeah, because Ross and Clifford are really, it's less of a timeshare now, but that's still a little bit of a timeshare. Hudson and Pena haven't been in timeshares at all this year. So if you're Denmark, can you push your way into that? For someone, for them to scheme something up for you, to get the ball in your hands a little bit and go. But I think that Denmark was someone who came in with a lot of attention, flipped from Oregon, was on Penn State's radar for forever. I think that was our first summer together back in 2022. Watching him on this,
still one of the best 7-on-7 performances I've seen. He was outstanding out there. Yeah,
he set a really high bar for every. I think that might have been my first 7-on-7 camp period. So he set a high bar moving forward. But yeah, we'll see. I think I'd be excited to see him get a little bit of run, but when you talk about tightening rotations in a big game, not exactly sure that'll be next week.
But you said it, former Oregon Ducks commit. Just keep that in your back pocket going into next Saturday. Who knows what could pop up? A couple things. It's always a good thing, whether Kodolnicki was talking to the team or to Franklin, to have your name being brought up by the offensive coordinator in a positive light after a practice session. So kudos to Tyseer Denmark for that. And I'll just note this. You talked about the enthusiasm. I can't remember if it was Marcus Hagans who told us this or one of those transfer receivers who's played a lot. But the feedback was like Tyseer, like no one celebrates big catches on the field for other guys more than Tyseer Denmark. Like he's on the sideline freaking out if Kyron Hudson's going up and getting a ball. And so sounds like he's been a consummate team player, and wide receiver has this kind of diva angle to it a lot of times. And so it's good to hear that Tyseer Denmark, although certainly not playing as much as I'd imagine he would like to play, seems to be bought in as a team player, and very strong feedback from Franklin, Kodolnicki, Hagans, and now we just got to wait and see on him, like you said. And Kobe Howard's another that we haven't seen a ton of, still waiting for his first career catch, I believe. So just some down the rung of the ladder a little bit at receiver, some things to monitor there. Speaking of young talent, James Franklin had some very interesting commentary that stood out to me, and I know it stood out to some people on our message board, where he was talking about essentially two types of young players, two types of freshmen. Guys who I guess are kind of quiet and going about their work, and maybe guys who have parents blowing up James Franklin's phone about why are my kids playing. I'm simplifying his commentary, but can you break it down a bit for us? Because it kind of reminds you that no matter the level of sports or no matter the level of football, mom and dad are still around, and guys want to play football. And in this modern age where that success on the field can equate to a pay raise for you pretty quickly as a college football player, not getting opportunities in game action, some people might say, is going to slow down your financial opportunity at this level. And so there's a new dynamic to the whole playing time conversation. Daniel, what did you get from James Franklin?
Yeah, it's when James Franklin has something that he wants to get off his chest and something that he wants to say, he can usually get there. And he made these comments in the same answer as him bringing up Tyseer Denmark. And it was a little bit of a contrast in terms of, Tyseer Denmark looks like someone who's hungry to get on the field and make a difference. And guys like that, you don't know when it's going to be, but when they get out there, they're going to be ready. Whereas you have other guys who are complaining that they should be playing, and they're going to get in the game and they won't be ready. And then Franklin says when that happens, then you won't hear from anyone. You won't hear from any parents, things like that. But yeah, I mean, these teams are enormous. Like you've got so many different players with so many different expectations, so many different needs. And then on top of that, when you have a really talented roster like Penn State's been able to put together, like I think they were number 9 in our team talent composite, or maybe a little bit higher than that. I think they're in their highest ever range too for blue chip ratio team talent composite. Like this is the most talent that Penn State has ever had on their roster in this modern era. And when you have that, I mean, there's a lot of egos because there's a lot of guys that come in, they were the best player on their high school team. Then you get to college and it might be a little bit different, but I think some of them realize that right away. Some people don't realize that right away. So there's just a whole bunch of, I think, egos you have to juggle, expectations that you have to set. These position coaches, I know that they all have their different styles. And we hear about how Terry Smith is the ultimate truth teller. And that's something that, works in his room. That is very talented, very competitive. I think also a little bit different in terms of the number of guys he can play and the areas where they can play. Which also is another factor in there. But yeah, it's interesting from Franklin. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's part of it that I think you can understand a little bit where if you see Penn State winning beating Villanova 52-6 and your kid hasn't played yet, you're kind of like, look, you were up by 45-0. Why couldn't you get so-and-so in for a couple snaps? Like, why couldn't you make an opportunity here? Why did these starters have to play into the third quarter of a game that you knew that you were going to win? So it's a an underrated part of the job, I think, when it comes to James Franklin and what the responsibilities are. We hear a lot about the tough conversations that he likes to have, the open communication. He wants to know what everyone's thinking. We know he's got that psych major. He's that psych degree from East Stroudsburg that he likes to use every now and again. But it's unenviable. That's the unenviable part of the job, and of just managing people in general is going through something like that. But I think that once we get into Big Ten play, you got to tighten these rotations a little bit. I think it'll be pretty clear who's ready and who's not.
Franklin didn't say this week, but I do wonder if it's not just parents now, if it's agents, because we live in that world, and agents have a little bit, maybe have a little bit more selfish need for players to get in the field and prove themselves early and get some game film out there. And so, yeah, you do wonder how much he's hearing it from all corners and how much he's able to shut that down and focus on the task at hand. But you're right, it's a huge roster. Everybody who's showing up on scholarship thinks they are going to be in the NFL in 4 or 5 years and then play in the league a long time. And it's tough to sit and watch football when you're used to being kind of a central focus throughout your career. And I'll tell you one thing, though. My father told me when I was in 8th grade, I went to him complaining about playing time. I think it was baseball back then. He said, if you have a problem with your playing time, I can't do anything for you. Go to your coach. Go talk to your coach. And I don't know. I know Franklin says open door policy, but for a freshman on a campus, it can be pretty intimidating to go knock on the coach's door and say, what the heck, man? So, we'll see if Franklin brings this up down the road, but it was kind of a perfect bye-week spot for him to air a little bit of a grievance, maybe purposely put some stuff out in the public conversation, and he accomplished that as we just spent 5 minutes discussing it here on the podcast. I wanted to jump over to 2 more coaches we heard from as we close out the show here. We got commentary from Jim Knowles, defensive coordinator, and also Justin Lustig, who's the special teams coordinator. He's in year 2, Knowles, of course, in year 1. And we'll start with a young linebacker who we saw for the first time in game 3, and I thought he flashed in a significant way. Alex Tash. I don't know what you saw on game film, but I know just his ability to track down the ball a little bit stood out to me for a guy getting his first action in Beaver Stadium. And what we got from Jim Knowles and then later from Justin Lustig, who also helps coach the linebackers, kind of painted the picture of a linebacker who could push the burn red shirt as Penn State's still navigating its depth behind Tony Rojas, Don DeLuca, and Amari Campbell.
Yeah, it's something that I always like to monitor over when we have these media availabilities is who's getting brought up unprompted. Like, who are the guys that these coaches and these other players have on their minds? I know that it's really nice to ask like the super specific question about a certain player or a certain situation, but every once in a while you got to throw a general one out there and see what comes to the surface. And that's what we got right away from Jim Knowles on Wednesday, is that he was asked, how do you feel about that depth behind that top 3 at linebacker? I think we know that Campbell, Rojas, and DeLuca are pretty well established in that top tier. We've heard it going back probably like a month now at this point. And after that, Penn State's been trying to figure out who's next. And Knowles said that they're still searching, said it twice. And then over the course of his answer, he says, yeah, we wanted to get Tash some run against Villanova, and we did that.
Daniel, can I just tell everyone how Jim Knowles sounded when he sounded like this? Still searching. That's kind of how he is a very unique interview, and he is about as open book in his assessment of players and where things stand in a position that I've ever heard, and I love it.
Yeah, so it was so you hear Tash's name, and going off of Dan Connor last week brought up Tash in a similar way, where like, hey, like we've got this top group, we're trying to figure out who's that next group, and oh yeah, by the way, this is a guy that we're thinking about, that's on our mind. And so you go back over like the course of the week and cobble everything together, and I think that it paints a picture of a player who is making an impression on them in practice, doing, for lack of a better term, like doing everything right, or at least doing what he's supposed to do, for these coaches and for these defenders. And so let me see if I have the specific Tash quote. Yeah, and so Knowles said that burning a red shirt could be a, quote, possibility for Tash. I don't think he's necessarily someone that we had on that preliminary internal green light list that where we're talking about the different freshmen and who we could see. I don't necessarily think he was someone that we viewed in that way coming
Hey,
into the season.
he's been your guy. He's been your guy for a while. But yeah, you haven't said he's going to burn redshirt, but let me know that Daniel's been saying since the spring. Tash just popped at him. So Daniel, you discovered him first.
Yeah, and so Knowles framed it as like an investment that you have to decide, like, is it going to be worth the investment to get someone meaningful practice snaps, meaningful game reps, sort of like what we just talked about with getting younger guys wanting to play and getting in games. Like, the coaches have to decide where they want to allocate these resources, because you only have so much practice time a week, and then game reps, you really don't know how many you're going to get. I think that a couple of years ago, that was a big thing in terms of the Penn State backup quarterbacks, where it was like, why didn't we see more backup quarterback play? And it was always, well, there weren't as many snaps as we thought there were going to be. But yeah, so I think this is for Tash to put himself in this position. It's notable. Lustig said that he could be someone who really embraces that special teams role, and maybe that's a way for him to get on the field more and burn that red shirt and move into a contributing role. He brought up Darius Dixon as someone who, maybe there wasn't the most set route to defensive playing time for him, but you see him on special teams in those first couple of games. He's making plays, he's making big hits, and he looks like he belongs out there. So you have more confidence in putting him in on defense. We'll see what that looks like.
I was just going to add that, with Lustig, he said it's really special teams at the forefront. If you're trying to get on the field, it's your path is more going to be earned for special teams. It's not just you find a way on defense and then they find a role for you on special teams. We've heard that even with Kobe Howard, just being a guy on coverage units along with playing receiver is going to be key for him if he's going to burn his redshirt status. And I think you mentioned Darius Dixon. Jim Knowles called him ahead of the curve compared to just about anybody he's encountered as a freshman defender at cornerback. He didn't really designate a position. He just said he's really at the top of the curve among these freshmen he's encountered, and he's over 20 snaps per game on defense along with his special teams role. And then Chaz Coleman, he said, has popped off the field since day one, and we've heard that from Jim Knowles going back to August. He says something that stood out to me, Daniel. He said he can pass rush against anybody. So that tells me they're ready to utilize him in some significant ways, and maybe on some key earlier downs and earlier moments against an Oregon to kind of disrupt things in the pocket. We'll see what they want to put on his plate moving into Big Ten play. I wanted to kind of get King Mack over to you just because we haven't heard from you on King Mack getting that starting job last week. And Jim Knowles also provided a kind of some analysis there and saying that he has taken advantage of the opportunity. He was also pointed out that it's going to remain a three-man competition with Antoine Belgrave-Schroeder, King Mack, and Dejan Lane. And by the way, Lane has actually led all safeties in snaps each of the last two games, despite not starting. Zakee Wheatley is locked in as a safety who's not going to leave the field much moving forward. But what do you make of the early ascension of King Mack? We saw him do some explosive things on special teams earlier this year, but now he's a starting safety. We'll see if he remains in that starting job against Oregon. But after that game, James Franklin said he felt like things were moving faster with King Mack involved. And so I think that would probably lead us to believe he'll still be in that first team lineup.
Yeah, I think that sort of commentary and what Knowles said about King Mack, it shows that this is a pretty difficult position to play in his defense in terms of what the responsibilities are that guys have. And it's a lot of younger guys fighting for these positions, where Antoine Belgrave-Schroeder, redshirt freshman who didn't play that much last year. Dejan Lane, sophomore who burned his red shirt, but that playing time went up and down over the course of the year. And then King Mack, who is a third-year college player, but has bounced around a little bit and hasn't necessarily had, I think, firm roles on defenses at Penn State or Alabama. So you've got different things working, for these guys as they're trying to learn the defense. And I think that one thing that Knowles said that stood out to me is something that I think has popped up here and there over the course of different guys talking about the defense, where he said that Mack has been around a lot more studying and he's taking advantage of the opportunity. That's something that we've heard different players talk about, going in to see Jim Knowles, to get some extra time with him, to sit down with him and learn these different things. It really, there's certain parts of this where, it really is like being a student and taking a class where if there's something that you don't get, like, you got to go see the professor, you got to go to office hours and sit down with them. And it almost sounds like the way that people talk about Knowles, it almost sounds like he has office hours in a way where guys can go in and talk to him and just be around. And it does sound like that Mac is someone who has taken advantage of that opportunity to be around and learn different things and iron out some things. And I think that's something that could come with being a third year player who has bounced around and seen some different things at this point in his career. But yeah, I think that it's interesting. Like, Jim Knowles said what we all know and what we all said, that he's a little undersized and that can make some matchup issues, but he's still really talented. And I think if you're putting in that extra effort to learn the scheme, that can maybe make up for some of those physical deficiencies at different points of the game.
Yeah, let's talk about special teams very quickly to finish off this show. We heard from Justin Lustig, who's in year 2. James Franklin has been highly complimentary of this special teams unit through 3 matchups. So have we here on the podcast. I talked about the return game earlier, kickoff and punt return in non-conference action. Gabe Nwosu, what he has done as a punter thus far in his new role. And then obviously Ryan Barker off to a fantastic start. 9 for 10 on field goals. His one miss was a blocked field goal from 50 plus as the first half expired against FIU, and it was a missed blocking assignment. So hard to hold that against the second-year starter at kicker. I think his commentary on the punt return game, though, stood out to me, Daniel. He said it was a major concern for them going into the offseason. That's his comment, not mine. Major concern going into the offseason about building quality depth at punt returner. And then you kind of fast forward to where they were in August. Zion Tracy is sidelined. Caden Saunders is out long-term. It could have gotten really ugly. Maybe they would have been Tyseer Denmark getting a shot there. But you got Pena, you got Ross, and all of a sudden, we've talked about this before, but it's starting to feel real. You're getting a group of playmakers who can grab the baton from a strong defense, run it forward a little bit, and hand it to your offense versus last year where it was like, cross your fingers, catch the ball, and get it to the offense, don't make a mistake. Now it's go out and do something and maybe get into the enemy territory.
Yeah, it's definitely something that has flipped a little bit, I think, from a neutral play into a positive play for Penn State, where when Caden Saunders was back there early last year, it was clear that the instructions were to fair catch. Zion Tracy gave them a little bit of juice. We know that with his background in high school, he's someone who can make plays with the ball in his hands, but it still really felt like that the primary job of that punt returner last year was to just catch the ball, get the offense out there, prevent the hidden yardage from the ball hitting the ground, and we'll go from there. With Pena and Ross, it seems like you can put a little bit of pressure onto an opposing special teams unit and pick up maybe some more hidden yards, where I think there's a difference between starting a drive at your own 20 versus at the 30, or at the 15 versus the 25. Like the game changes based on those sorts of things. And I think that Penn State is in a position where they can make some things happen there. I think that's been a really big positive when you look at these first 3 games of learning something new about this team that maybe wasn't there before, that we didn't really think about last year. I think that punt return unit definitely stands out as one.
Let's close things out with some focus on the 6'6", 300-pound specialist for Penn State. As I mentioned, Nwosu off to a strong start as a punter, booming the ball. You can see why he earned the starting job and supplanted Riley Thompson, who came over from Australia to play college football, started at FAU, and was the starting punter here for Penn State the last couple of years. Now he's your starting holder and their backup punter. But we got some kind of a little bit of I guess, pulling the curtain back a little bit on the place kicker situation and how Nwosu could factor in, because James Franklin has teased a few times that he was involved and maybe pushing Barker during preseason camp. And he was Lustig was directly asked this week, is Nwosu a guy who come out as a long distance, as a long range specialist? And I thought it was interesting that his mind flashed right back to that USC game last year, not to Ryan Barker's game winner in overtime, but recall the final play of regulation when Drew Aller chucks up one of those Hail Marys from midfield. He says last year the trust was not there. They wouldn't have trotted out Gabe. Now he said it might be different. 65, 66, where are the percentages? Heaving the ball up into a crowd of defensive backs and wide receivers, or sending out the strong-legged kicker to give it a shot. So it could be something to monitor, I think, particularly maybe end-of-half situations, perhaps end-of-game situations if we get there. Wouldn't that be dramatic? But ultimately, maybe there's a situation here where Barker is going to handle things to a certain extent, and they've got a designation line where Wosu all of a sudden is your long-range place kicker. And so just something to monitor moving forward, as he's the guy who's been very valued. Daniel, anything else you want to throw into the podcast from Knowles, Franklin, Lustig that I may have missed before we say goodbye to folks?
No, I think that we've got some pieces up on Lions247 about Gabe Wosu with the commentary from Justin Lustig. We talked about that commentary on Alex Tash from Dan Connor, from Jim Knowles, from Justin Lustig. I've got all that together in a story on Lions247, and I think that it's been pretty busy, even though it's the bye week. The Penn State, they're still out in the practice field working. We're still working behind the scenes, and I think we're trying to set the table for a very busy week and a very fun week next week.
And we'll be back with a bunch of podcasts for you starting Monday off of James Franklin's press conference, Oregon week in full gear. We'll have a lot to discuss, and just want to give a huge shout out to Daniel and Mark Brennan, but carrying the weight this week, because not only am I away, but on the way down here, my 3-year-old's water bottle spilled on my laptop, and my laptop has not been able to start since then. Got a new one on the way, but it has been a bit of a challenge. We're working through our own challenges in this bye week personally, but really appreciate Daniel for stepping up and doing a little extra in my absence on the line a little bit. So appreciate that, man.
No problem. It's teamwork.
That's right. We value that here at Lions247, and hopefully that's reflected in our podcast. We'll come back to you next week. In the meantime, head over to Lions247.com for a bunch of coverage. And by the way, recruiting news is coming fast and furious as we get closer to this huge recruiting spectacle for the Whiteout game. So Tyler Calvaruso, Brian Doan, and our great team of analysts have you covered on the top prospects, and there are many of them coming to fill seats in Beaver Stadium next Saturday. On behalf of Daniel Gowan, I am Tyler Donahue. Appreciate you for listening or watching the Lions247 podcast.